back for our afternoon session. Please welcome to the stage the Executive Director for Partners for Automated Vehicles Education, Tara Andringa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. So excited to join you. As I said, my name is Tara Andringa, and I'm the Executive Director of Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. This morning, we talked a little bit about the need to engage with the public and educate the public and level set on this technology. So that's what we do. We're a 501c3 to educate the public about AVs. It's been a great day, and I especially want to thank Senator Brandes for his incredible leadership in both pulling this day together and in this space overall. We've spent a lot of time today and in general talking about some of the potential benefits of autonomous vehicles, the safety, efficiency, the ability to provide new mobility options for people. Our conversation this afternoon is about perhaps one of the more complicated topics, which is sustainability. Obviously, the transportation system creates 29% of the emissions in the United States, and we have to either reduce or get rid of 6 billion tons of emissions every year to meet 2050 net zero. We believe that AVs can play an important role in that, but if how that's rolled out is every single person is driving an internal combustion engine vehicle that drives itself, obviously we're going to increase vehicle miles traveled and won't get there. So we need to ensure that this new system that we're creating is, and when we're looking at the future of transportation, that we are helping to meet our climate goals. So we have 3 incredible panelists today who are experts in this area who are going to talk about this overlap between AVs and EVs. So I want to welcome Carter Stern from Cruise, who is the Head of Government Affairs for International and Domestic New Markets. And Justin Hopson from Hitachi, who is the Director of Solution Engineering for the Environment Business Division for Hitachi Americas. And Werner Engl from ZF, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Sales for AD Systems. So first, I'm just going to let each of our guests give a brief introduction about what they are doing in this space. Carter, I'll start with you.
Terrific. So my name's Carter Stern. I work for a company called Cruise. We design and build and operate fleets of autonomous, all-electric robotaxis, as well as last-mile delivery vehicles. I handle all of our government affairs. Easier to say what I don't do. I don't do California. Other than that, I have the rest of the country and the world, working on both AV policy and strategy, as well as the EV side.
Great. Justin.
So Justin Hopson, I work for Hitachi Americas, which is the umbrella organization that has 80 different Hitachi companies that roll into it. The 4 that are probably most relevant for our conversation today is Hitachi Energy, which is a joint venture with ABB Power Grids. We make chargers, we make renewable energy microgrids, we do energy management systems. Also work with Hitachi Astemo, which is an automotive parts business. Work with Hitachi Vantara, which is our digital integration arm, and I'll talk a little bit about Global Logic, which does in-vehicle systems.
Werner.
Yeah, my name is Werner Engl. I'm working for ZF, the less known of the big automotive suppliers. We are amongst the big 3, Bosch and Continental, the biggest in the world, working since 107 years in this business, and we have decided 7 years to develop in a business unit AD solutions, which means components, software stacks, and a complete shuttle. And I'm the head of sales of this department, and yeah, very happy to be the first time at the FAV and joining this group here on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. Excited for the conversation. Carter, I'm going to start with you. One of the common arguments that people try to make is that electric vehicles also are imperfect. They have no tailpipe emissions, but that they generating electricity usually creates pollution, and there's emission from the manufacture of batteries. Can you talk about just really big picture, can you talk about the comparative carbon footprint of gasoline-powered vehicles versus electric vehicles?
Sure. So you're going to have, obviously, tailpipe emissions is the first piece. And when you think about impact on community, a big impact that we see is the ppm 2.5, right? So the local emissions, the effect on kids with, like my son who has asthma, older folks, there's an impact on, heart health. So that's the localized issue. More broadly, even in Texas where I live, we on many days of the year generate half of our electricity from renewables. Oil and gas city, my whole family has been involved in the oil and gas industry, not to besmirch that industry, but we're seeing much more generation coming from renewable sources as well. So it matters where you're getting that electricity. But also, a gas-powered engine is incredibly dirty. And so you think about non-renewable sources such as natural gas. No, it is not as good as a windmill, but it's a lot better than burning coal. It's a lot better than using an internal combustion engine. So these impacts are all varied, but we're trying to get down to the point where we're having the least impact that we could possibly have, both in the areas where we operate, but also more globally.
Great. And then Justin, want to talk a little bit about timelines. We hear lots of predictions, and in fact, all three of your companies, Hitachi said they'll be carbon neutral at business sites by 2030 and the interior value chain by 2050. ZF's strategies is to be completely climate neutral by 2040. GM said they'll be neutral in products and operations by 2040. But we are a community of skeptics, given all the people that said we'd have AVs everywhere by 2020. Curious both if these timelines are realistic, and then also what are the dangers of failing to meet these deadlines?
They are aggressive. And we've been looking at our Scope 1, our Scope 2, and our Scope 3 emissions because we are a supplier, right? We're a tier 1 to the OEMs. We're a manufacturer in our own right. And we're an asset-based trucking company through Carter Logistics. So when I look at the amount of education that's required in a large global company, just so people understand, right, what you just shared about what are the impacts on people and how does that affect my family and why would I want to embrace policies of change? And as they get deeper into it, then they start to ask, what's this going to cost? Do you have a budget for that? And so I've been encouraged through the conversations at Hitachi that there's a lot of investment out of Japan to really change how we operate. And because we're in everybody else's supply chain, we're changing their carbon footprint as well. And it's also driving a remanufacturing conversation about where do these assets go at end of life? So for example, through Hitachi Ventures, we've invested in battery recycling because we're looking at the reuse of a lot of materials.
And then I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper on that and talk about the partnership between the public sector and private sector. So both in the US and in the EU, the Biden administration announced a goal of 50% of vehicles sold by 2030 should be EVs. The EU announced in October of this year that it'll ban non-electric vehicles after 2035. And that's kind of where I wanted to start is the president of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association said that he wants to see the EU help industry with this transition, and his quote was, "Make no mistake, the European automobile industry is up to the challenge, but we're keen to see the framework conditions that are essential to meet these target policies." And I'm curious, how critical is policy change in meeting these goals, and are these companies' goals realistic without big regulatory changes? Are they attainable independently?
First of all, and I can speak for Europe, but I think in America it's the same, we are also part of the development of these regulations. Yeah? Of course, we are not the legislation, but there is an intensive discussion between stakeholder groups before we come to new regulatories. And not always the targets are, let me say, perfect for everybody. So it's also clearly the task to create a certain level of stress to the participants. And it's not a secret that the phase out of combustion engines in Europe in 2035, this creates stress. ZF is since 60 years one of the biggest producers of automatic transmissions. We just discovered that your Engl has a ZF transmission.
Yes.
Jason is very satisfied. This will come to an end. And we're producing 3.5 million per year in the United States, as well as, of course, in Germany. And this is a huge investment into the conversion. We have developed electric drives. We are selling them, but this leads to a chain of consequences on occupation, on assets, on technologies, which has to be managed. What I can tell you is that this is something which I would now create a bridge to autonomous driving. We said 10 years the world will be electrical. Nobody knows when, and then some of the developments have accelerated very much during the last years. Our second strategic goal is the world will be autonomous. And just look to your vacuum cleaner you have at home. 30, 40 years ago, this would have been science fiction. No, now it cleans and it runs, and okay, it's slower than a shuttle, but we are totally convinced of that. And to me, entrepreneurship also means to be convinced of something. And if someone asks me if the goal to be CO2 neutral in 2040 is realistic, I would always answer yes. If I start now, 18 years before, modifying, doubting, being skeptical, I will for sure not reach this goal, because at the end I want to prove that I was right to be skeptical. So I believe that we are all doing well in accepting such a challenge and going forward. And if at the end it's 2041, nobody will die of that. But if we start so many years before, putting question marks all the time, we would do a mistake. Coming back to your questions, we are part of such discussions. We accept these challenges. Not every regulation is the perfect one for us, but we accept also that this is a balancing of interest, and between us, I think it's warm enough, at least during the summer times in Germany.
Right, absolutely. And want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges, and there's really a series of challenges. The challenge of greatly increasing the quantity of electricity, the ability of utility companies to provide the electricity, the infrastructure to charge the vehicles, the technology. There's a lot of dominoes that all need to be aligned. So Carter, a lot of questions about grid preparedness and how the grid can support this level of growth and demand for electricity. There's an interesting story that I saw, and I know you don't do California, but the U.S. News & World Report had a story that talked about within the same week, California announced that they were going to ban the sale of gasoline-powered cars by 2035. Within the same week, they asked electric car owners to cut back on charging their cars because of a heat wave that was happening. It just kind of spotlights this challenge. Obviously there are a lot of efforts being made to address this. The infrastructure bill include like $5 billion for grid upgrades. But curious, how big of a challenge is this? How much of a stumbling block is the grid issue to meeting these goals?
I mean, it's huge. It's huge. I mean, when you think about the transition, if we're at the AV conference, we're talking about AV and EV. I think we talk a lot about how AV is going to be this huge leap, and it is. But oftentimes when I'm talking to policymakers, especially at the state and local level, a much larger issue is how we're going to prepare, not just for fleet vehicles like mine that are going to be plugged into the grid, but when everyone has the ability to use an electric vehicle that's plugged into the grid, the amount of both just the time it's going to take to install that infrastructure as well as the cost is going to be tremendous. Where do you fit it all? How do you plug it all in and ensure you're generating enough electricity? How do you make sure it's where it needs to be? I think there's been a lot of talk about highway corridors. That's great for interstate commerce. For most of our trips of people in this room, as well as myself, it's picking my kids up from school, it's going to the grocery store, it's going to work. It's not long distance trips, so I need a place to charge at work or at the grocery store. But I'm very encouraged in that utility companies are viewing this as a major opportunity for them, to increase their customer base, increase their footprint in the cities where they operate. So, I won't name the city, but there's one city we're looking at moving into right now, And we talk to the local utility once a week because they're really excited. They know this is coming, and they recognize it's going to be a tremendous challenge for them to do it in time. So I think what happened in California only underscores the scope of the challenge that we're going to face on the infrastructure side.
Right, for sure. And then Justin, want to kind of dig into that a little bit more. I said it in a really simplistic way about all these challenges, but I think there are a lot of steps and intricacies that people don't know and understand. Curious if you can just kind of walk through some of the steps in creating the electricity needed to meet these goals.
Yeah, so what we've found is it helps if you start with what people already know. So if you think about your fleet plan, some folks it's a 5-year view, others it's a 10, 15, 20-year view. And so you already have a thought for what are my use cases, what different classes of vehicle do I need, what kind of range do they need, and then you say, okay, great. Now let's start to put together the demand curve. What kind of energy is going to be required as you move from a fossil fuel to an electrical source? And it turns out it's just math. You add it all up, you do a little math and say, oh, this is going to be something measured in megawatts. And for a person who's been running a depot where it's just lights and HVAC, that may be new. So you realize, oh, as I'm having this fleet planning conversation, I also need to have an energy management conversation. So the easiest thing to do is call your utility. What's the size of my interconnect? Is there a capacity on my feeder? Is this going to be easy? Or are we capacity constrained? Are we going to be a couple years out on a build? Should I start to think about renewable energy, distributed energy like solar or solar PV? Should I start to think about wind? Do I need a battery energy storage system because of my time of use? Right? You all of a sudden you start digging into the tariff and starting to understand what is my total cost of ownership going to look like in this new world? And the good news is you can actually put that whole plan together and then start to think about, oh, operationally, what are the changes? What goes away in not just the EV world, but the AV world? What doors does that open up? Do I do less maintenance? Can I do my maintenance at a different time? Right? And that really opens the door to thinking more creatively about, okay, I'm going on this big journey, but change is often an opportunity. So started with the grid, then getting out into transformers and all the site work, right? You're gonna have a project where you're running cables all over, and then lastly, you're gonna have that charger thing, right? People wanna know, what does that look like? How do I train my technicians? How do my drivers interact differently with this vehicle? And you realize, oh, the technology might not even be the hardest part. It might actually be the change management of the people.
Also, if I might add something here.
Yeah.
We have to focus on the two aspects. So one is how do we produce the energy? How sustainable is that? And you mentioned that with wind and PVs. The other one is how do we use energy? Yeah? What is the absolute value of energy consumptions in developed countries like the United States or Germany? And it's a fact that if the world was consuming energy as we do in Germany and the United States, we would have, I don't know, 60 degrees already. This is simply not a model for the world. And my personal statement is, it's hard to understand for developing countries that the developed countries tell them, please don't do as we have done and are still doing, because this is a bad way for all of us. And great part, this is politics. Personally, I'm convinced that we have to work on both areas. The first area is to become sustainable in the production of energy. This is a must for the world, but it's also a must for us to show others that we are doing the right thing. And the second is, how can we reduce the consumption of energy? And it's our conviction that just substituting cars with combustion engines by electrical cars will not save a lot of energy. Yeah? And I'm not talking about the source of the energy.
Right.
Yeah? We have to think about, and this is the motto of this summit here, how can we make mobility more collective? How can we overall save energy and still bring people from A to B, because the need for mobility is not changing, yeah? It's even increasing. except some periods like COVID, everybody was at home. And I think this is a task, and this is also a responsibility of developed countries to show what is possible, to invest this money. Maybe the bitter pill at the end for companies, it must be a business case. Whatever is the regulatory framework, at the end we have to make money, earn money, because if everybody's bankrupt at the end, nobody has gained something. So this is a little bit the connection between electric vehicles and what we're discussing here. Just electrify everything and continuing the lifestyle and the mobility habits as we have them developed over the last 30, 40 years will not lead to a drastic reduction of energy consumption.
For sure. Kurt, I wanted to ask you a question about charging infrastructure. Cruise, obviously, from the get-go has been all electric and really stepped up to the plate to create the infrastructure in San Francisco. I read that Cruise owns like 40% of the charging infrastructure in the city. That seems manageable in a limited ODD. But curious about the scalability of that. When you start looking at less densely populated places and more rural communities, like how do you create the needed charging infrastructure for the vehicles?
It's a good question. So, we right now own and operate the largest piece of charging infrastructure in North America in San Francisco. Real estate there is really expensive. Permitting is, as it is in any city, is a challenge. And there's been a lot of lessons that have come out of that. I think initially we enter a new market, we'll want to have that charging behind the fence for our use. And part of that is indicative of the lack of publicly available charging infrastructure in any major city in the United States, no matter how progressive or forward-looking. There is just a lack of charging infrastructure in general, and we're in the first quarter of the transition to fully electric transportation for everybody. Moving forward, I think we will see more partnerships, whether it's between a building owner who has charging infrastructure there for tenants going to work during the day, apartment buildings, municipal charging infrastructure available on the street, and we'll see co-investment, so co-funding of some of that infrastructure. But I think the real opportunity for cities, business owners, et cetera, when it comes to partnering with large fleet operators of electric vehicles, fleets of electric vehicles, is that we can drastically boost the utilization of that infrastructure. So right now, you go to your office where there's 2 chargers, you go to Whole Foods, one may be full, but oftentimes it's not being used. So the question for the business owner is the obvious: why on earth am I installing this infrastructure at great expense if it's not going to get used? So it becomes this chicken or the egg issue. And so our sort of theory is that we can be a catalyst for that transition. We can be a catalyst for increased investment in charging infrastructure to make the business case work, because altruism is not going to get us there. And that, as we get further down the road, there will be a mix of charging infrastructure that we install that's available just to us, that's available to us and the public, publicly available charging infrastructure that we don't install, that we are just using. We may use late at night, early in the morning, off-peak hours. But it's, I think that charging, as I already said, the charging infrastructure piece is potentially the biggest brake on growth for large operators of electric fleets. And so there's going to be, hopefully we are a catalyst, but ultimately we can't do it by ourselves, and ultimately it doesn't do the public good as much good as it could if that charging infrastructure isn't also available to members of the public to charge their own vehicle.
For sure. And then another issue, obviously, Justin, that comes up a lot is about range. And then when you look at AVs, that's exacerbated because they have sensors and all these computers that suck up lots of energy, which is obviously even a further challenge. How much of a stumbling block is this? And how far can fully electric AVs travel, and how does that compare to other EVs?
There's really good work done by NACFE, and I would absolutely want everybody to see it. It's called Run on Less, and they do a really nice job of breaking it down by use case and by vehicle type, and you see this really great progression, like, hey, the thing you already see in your neighborhood might be the school bus, that's already here. Might be Amazon and FedEx delivering packages, right? That's already here. And Part of that is there's early trials, but the other part is the long run economics of that look really good. So I think that segment will move quickly. I think some of your middle mile, that's going to go in the next couple of years as we talk to the OEMs about what are your plans, how are you starting to shift your vehicle mix, do you really believe there's going to be the infrastructure? And particularly for those that operate in a depot context, they can control that operationally and they can size that battery. And so range isn't an issue as long as you've got stability, right? If you run a bus route, if you run delivery routes and you can control that, you can move now. The ones I don't see yet is like long haul heavy freight, at least in the US. I think Europe will lead us in that one.
Sorry, this is the advertisement block. We have developed the C-Trucks, an electric drive for trucks. Our customer DAF, part of the Packer group, has shown that this year in September the first time, and they will start with that. Of course, this is very much mission depending. And strangely enough, the first thing I look on an electric vehicle, what is the maximum autonomy? Mm-hmm. Yeah? I don't know, 300 miles or 600 kilometers or whatever. Exactly knowing that not of the kilometers, but of the drives. 90% drives are happening in a range of 20 miles, 30 miles, so easily covered by the autonomy of electric vehicles. For trucks, this is similar because if you look to the typical distribution truck or something garbage truck operating in the defined area, that's easier. When we go to long haul, of course, it makes less sense because the size of the battery will reduce your payload continuously. So there is more the idea in future to use, for example, hydrogen fuel cell solutions, which guarantee long haul. Nikola is one of the startups working in that area. But the technology exists, and I'm very much in favor of looking to the different missions, looking to the different use cases, what makes sense for a shuttle working in an urban context, not necessarily makes sense for a distribution truck or for a forklift or whatever. Nonetheless, we state that the future will be electrical because the technology itself exists. And you might know that the first electrical cars have been developed 1905 by Austro-Steyr, by the way. And then the combustion engine won the race for several reasons. The biggest game changer will be battery capacity. And you know that companies are developing different systems, storage systems or chemical solutions, and this might change. But again, I do not see the private car as the right solution for a long distance trip. Maybe this is more the train or the airplane with green fuels, not the private car.
Okay. Carter, I wanted to ask you a question. I know it's something Cruise cares deeply about equitable access. For a lot of people, charging happens at home, but that creates barriers for people who don't live somewhere where they have just dedicated parking places. Curious, especially when we're talking about mandates that there will be no new cars sold that aren't electric, how can we help ensure that this is a technology that's accessible to everybody?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've thought about a lot over the course of the last year is there's been a lot of talk about making funding available for charging infrastructure. If I can afford a six-figure vehicle that's electric, I don't know that I need a subsidy to install that charging infrastructure. Now, when you're looking at folks who live in apartment complexes, people who are renters, I think the challenge becomes much more acute. Outfitting a garage in an apartment complex with hundreds of chargers is just not going to happen without some kind of a mandate, which I don't really like to think about. As good policy, I don't know that that's the best route to go. So I think it's going to be a combination. I think as there is more demand for charging infrastructure, as electric vehicles become more common, it's going to be an amenity that you have to have. And every new condo, every new home, every new apartment complex is going to feature plenty of charging infrastructure for all the residents. In most cities, in sort of Sunbelt cities, there's 5 parking spots for every table at a restaurant or every door in an apartment complex. So we've overbuilt that infrastructure. So I don't think we need a charging. We don't need a plug at every single parking slot. But I think the states are going to have to step in and provide some money. Federal government is going to provide some money. There's going to be an economic incentive to those property owners. But when we think about underserved communities, it's going to have to come from the state. And one of the things that I think about a lot with regards to our product is that if we have to put and I'm not as familiar with Florida, but it's going to be very difficult to get a ton of parking space and charging infrastructure into downtown Miami, just like it is in downtown Austin, Texas. And we're going to be looking for opportunities, as our other fleet operators, for places we can locate that charging infrastructure where it's less expensive. Oftentimes, those are going to be in communities, disadvantaged communities or that have seen a lack of investment. And so that's when I talk about the option to make some of the charging infrastructure available to the public. Like, that's the killer opportunity, is to go into a community in which they're not going to see that investment, either on their own or from other sources. We can install that infrastructure, we can make it available, so when someone is looking at an electric vehicle and they're thinking, God, where am I going to charge that thing? They know down the street or around the block there's a place to charge that vehicle. And then once it's there, once the utility has built the back-end infrastructure, it's there forever, for the foreseeable future. And the way that infrastructure is used, who owns it, will evolve. But you've got that backbone, that infrastructural backbone that you can use.
For sure.
Tara, let me be a little bit controversial. If the loading infrastructure now is just following the mobility habits we have now, electrified, this would be a mistake. Yeah? They have to anticipate what can happen in the future, what are the changes. And last week I was in Oslo, in Norway, and I don't know how famous Oslo is outside of Norway. This is a city which, of course, based on a pretty wealthy population, has decided years ago to change the mobility habits drastically. Parking is something like $50 per day if you have access to the inner city. They are actively trying to push cars out from the city center, and they are increasing the circle every year. They have a plan, and authority there is called Brulte, to use 30,000 shuttle/on-demand vehicles. They have tests with NEO, with Navia, with several already running, to substitute the individual car by something else. Yeah? So if we come to the charging structure, I'm pretty sure that it will take maybe 2-3 years when the autonomous driving, driverless, and the driverless is important because there is a lack of driver, and the driver is a cost on board in a commercial vehicle application like a bus. If this is ready for large deployments, you can offer a real alternative to people with their individual cars, as well as what Cruise is doing with vehicles on demand. And please have a look on Oslo. I was so impressed at 10 at night. People are constantly passing with the red light, also the pedestrians, of course, because there is no car cruising on the streets anymore. And they have an idea which means something different than just substituting the today's traffic and electrifying the today's traffic, including loading stations, charging stations, etc. I think we will see great things coming there, and this will be an example for others as well.
Absolutely great.
I hope this was controversial enough.
No, it's not controversial. I mean, if you think about the sustainability of cities, what would you do? You'd get rid of parking, you'd keep cars out, you would encourage transit, and you'd require anything that's in there to be electric. I think that's
one thing is
politically, it's not controversial.
One thing is parking. Yeah,
Parking is the biggest.
Parking management, taking parking lots out step by step. It has also been politically accepted by the citizens. As a Lord Mayor, you want to be re-elected maybe and not press people too much, but parking management is an issue, travel restrictions, entering in the cities, and offering an alternative, of course. If you cannot just go by foot now, as we have done in the past.
And then along that note, I'm curious if, we've talked about the importance of electrifying, but how much of the issue also is the quantity of vehicles? How much do we need to think mobility more broadly in the concept of personally owned vehicles to achieve these goals? I mean, is the issue, solely internal combustion engines, or is it the, single occupancy vehicles as well? I mean,
Both. I think we built American cities around the personally owned vehicle. I have no plans to get rid of any of the vehicles in my family ever, and I don't think we should mandate that. I don't think that we should require that, but we can encourage that kind of behavior. And so, initially it was TNCs, right? Like if you can ride a Lyft or an Uber, you will never need a personal car. Well, that's not really true. But if you can substitute some trips, great. If you can reduce parking in cities, you can get rid of parking minimums. I don't know if there's any mayors here, but get rid of the parking minimums, and charge for parking and use that to fund infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I think when we have, and this is obviously I'm voting with my feet, with who I work for, but I think the opportunity, the option to take an autonomous vehicle that picks you up where you are, drops you off, and then for all intents and purposes disappears until you need it again is a great option for people to have. If you want to ride your bike to work and you need to get somewhere in the afternoon, you can take an autonomous shuttle. Amazing. But I tend to think about transportation more as this really varied ecosystem, and we need to have the right pieces in that ecosystem to encourage those good policy outcomes rather than hey, this is the one bad thing that exists. This is the one thing that can fix it, because if anybody tells you they have a silver bullet, they're pulling your leg, I think.
We're almost out of time, but I want to kind of end on one, I think, critical issue. I was talking to Senator Brandes earlier this week about this. We've already talked about kind of the public sector and private sector needing to work, or industry needing to work together. But I think we also really need to think much more broadly about partnerships and about where, in terms of charging infrastructure, restaurants and hotels and truck stops and all the other voices that we need to be part of this conversation to make this work. Curious both if you all can just kind of reflect on the voices that you don't feel like are yet part of this conversation that we really need to engage. And then the other thing, because it's so near and dear to my heart and what we do at PAVE, is we really need to convince people that this matters and to make these changes and to change their choices. And how do we engage with the public, and how do we really make the public understand the gravity of this? Two totally different questions, but I would love to just kind of get your thoughts on either of these issues. Werner.
I feel a strong willingness for these partnerships, and the fact that we are all sitting here is one of the signs for that. And I can tell you in Europe it's exactly the same. Mm-hmm. There is also political pressure to act, and it is about the Clean Air Acts, you mentioned that before, and there is no doubt about that we need that, and that this is happening. Personally, I see, and you use the word, we have to convince people. Yeah? I don't think that we have to convince. We have to create consciousness, is that the right word? Mm-hmm. Consciousness for what needs to be done. Yeah? And the best thing in our society is that a lot of people, a majority, is then convinced, but not having been convinced, but convincing themselves. This is a good way to go, at least to test and explore, to invest in that area. But again, there's no question that there is a strong will to partner between public and companies.
When I think about it is, as individuals, what will people's transitions look like? An example for me is where the school bus is from an electrification standpoint. Everybody goes, yeah, electric school bus. I don't want diesel gassing out my kids. That sounds great. But from the autonomous school bus, I'm not going to have any adults. It's going to go fine. Like, no way, right?
It's just children.
Yeah, right? So if you think about that journey, it's like, okay, but how might we get there? And one of the examples I like is with last mile delivery. As you look at autonomous vehicles that then allow the operator to really be focused on the package and getting the delivery done and working in the back. And so you create efficiency. You create better utilization of that asset. The economics work, and people socially, they're like, oh, so it'd be lower cost and I would get it sooner, and like, oh, there's something in it for me. Well, if we could all get there, then you say, well, could I have a chaperone on the bus? And would that actually change that moment in the day? And I would change the role of the adult on the bus. And you think, oh, yeah, maybe. That's interesting.
We also have to work in another aspect. Using public transport must become prestigious, sexy in a way. Using the car, and again, Europe with the smaller cities we have, they have a higher pressure on that. Look to Copenhagen, I described Oslo. You know, going with your own private car, even electric to the city, becomes something like, I don't know, eating meat or smoking. It's still legal, but less and less seen well. And this is something where I believe, and I'm strongly convinced, with autonomous driving, we can create something which is smart, which looks different, which feels different, and which convinces people to leave the car at home, or in future to have less cars, or even no car in the very city centers. We are on the right track with that, and autonomous driving plus electric, of course. By the way, there is no combustion engine autonomous driving vehicle in the world. This is the right thing we are doing here.
For sure, and we could have a whole conversation about lessons learned from Europe, but you're way ahead of us in this regard. But sadly, we're out of time. Thank you all for the great conversation, and thanks to the audience for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, for our next panel, please welcome to the stage the founder of Brulte & Company, Grayson Brulte.
Tara, that was a great panel. Thank you for organizing that. We're going to do these a little different. Series of 4 presentations, and we're going to kick it off with Kevin Miller, Senior Director, Public Policy at ChargePoint. Please welcome Kevin to the stage.
How's everyone doing? Oh, now you can hear me. Oh, hi. I'm Kevin Miller, Senior Director of Public Policy for ChargePoint, the leading provider of electric vehicle charging solutions. We are in the final stretch of day 1. You're doing it. We're almost there. I know nothing gets a crowd pumped up more after sitting in a room and listening all day to sitting in a room and listening all day, so I will try and keep track of time and keep it going. I'm really grateful to the Jacksonville Transportation Authority for hosting us all. To Nathaniel Ford for sharing some of the exciting things that JTA has been doing, and Assistant Secretary Thornburg for setting the stage for a really interesting discussion over the course of the day. I specifically want to thank Senator Brandis for a decade of supporting innovation in transportation at the FAV Summit. This commitment shows that he sees where markets and technology are going, but also that he's willing to take the shots and lead folks to where we need to go before they see where that is. It's not easy to be ahead of the curve. As recently as 2 years ago, I was laughed out of a meeting with a state Department of Transportation up north, a state which I shall not name, when I pitched them on leaning into electric transportation infrastructure. They didn't think it was the right time, but times have definitely changed. I also wanted to note that as a neophyte to AV issues, it's been really eye-opening and fantastic to follow along with some of the fascinating discussions today to see what y'all are facing. I loved Brad Templeton's insights about the paradigm shift from horse and buggy to cars, especially the idea about how folks didn't want to move away from the rein whip interface. I'm going to be thinking about that for quite a while. So, like in the AV world, the EV world is going through a paradigm shift. EV charging demand is going to increase 5 times by 2030. So, are we ready? It's a pretty good dramatic opening, right? Let me give you a little background on ChargePoint. ChargePoint was founded in 2007 with the goal of ensuring that every vehicle mile traveled for transportation for people and goods can be electric. We're a Silicon Valley startup with offices around the world, operating primarily in North America and Europe. At ChargePoint, our engineers are building the fueling network of the future today. People are powering their cars with zero emissions at work and at home at times that benefit them and the grid and their pocketbooks. Others take advantage of electric buses, electric rideshare, autonomous options to complete everything they need to do in a day. The technology that's driving this change already exists, and there's a good chance that a ChargePoint engineer had a hand in it if you engage with it. Our primary business model is to provide smart EV charging hardware and software solutions to independent local owners and operators of EV charging. We support customers in literally every market segment, from residential to highway, workplace, community locations, light, medium, heavy-duty vehicle fleets, AC charging to DC charging. In fact, an overlap with the AV world, earlier this year, ChargePoint and Gatik announced a strategic partnership to develop an electric ecosystem for autonomous and electric medium-duty trucks, maximizing sustainability, efficiency, and the economics underlying all that for ChargePoint and Gatik's customers. All of the chargers that we deploy and manufacture and design, or that we will even deign to look at, are smart and networked. Smart network chargers are going to play a key role in on-ramping the significant increase in renewable energy to support a distributed grid. We view smart charging as just a fundamental necessity. We don't design or build chargers that aren't smart capable, because friends don't let friends charge dumb. Our hardware and software solutions are purpose-built for specific situations, so that we always have the right tool for the job. From our level 2 charging stations that can support key energy integration, either on-site or partnering with a utility, to fully modular and scalable direct current fast charging solutions to support highway charging needs today and as they increase over time without having to break concrete twice. So ChargePoint is a phenomenal place to work. I get to the privilege to work with so many folks who have such a long track record of success, specifically in corridor charging. We've implemented highway corridor charging across the country over 15 years, and we don't just provide the solution. We have dedicated cross-functional implementation teams to make sure that we're working with partners, whether they're old hands at EV charging or whether they're new to the ecosystem. Because ultimately, you charge your car where you park your car, and that means we don't just have to rely on pit stop situations. We don't have to pattern match to traditional quick fill gas locations, though those are going to be a key part of the ecosystem as well. So we have implementation teams to make sure that no matter where the charger is being deployed, every place you park your car is one where you can charge it. Recently, we have been, as we have for many years, we've been deeply committed to Florida for years, but recently we've had some exciting groundbreakings associated with support from Florida's DEP. We partnered with Wawa to deploy direct current fast chargers What we have pictured here is a charger in Port St. Lucie, which was supported with the state's Volkswagen Dieselgate mitigation program. And since September 1st, those chargers have delivered thousands of charging sessions before, after, and during Hurricanes Ian and Nicole for those who were using and needing them during evacuations. This is like a dream come true for me. This is my first private sector job. Before that, I worked in the public sector. I was a CFO for energy and environmental agencies in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where we engaged with these types of issues and tried to think about how we could set up funding programs in a way that both achieved the lofty goals that we needed to, ensuring energy environmental equity goals, creating a fantastic grid asset that still does the job that a car needs to do, while also creating significant public value and leveraging private sector dollars. And I try and keep some of those lessons with me as I engage around the country and as I have been doing so at ChargePoint for 7 years. I'm going to speak briefly about the EV charging ecosystem a little bit more. I'm going to talk about the National EV Infrastructure Program and share some thoughts about best practices moving forward. The story of how Florida, the US, and the world are going to massively scale access to EVs and EV charging isn't going to be written by one single author. For more than a decade, businesses have already been investing private capital to attract EV drivers who are their customers, their residents, their drivers, and they do that to create an ancillary stream of revenue, but also to accelerate their own business models. To the extent that a retail store can increase customer dwell time while also providing a valuable asset to that customer is a win-win situation. And that creates some relief from pressure to solely rely on revenue from the sale of charging services. By having folks who are interested from a lot of different perspectives involved in that ecosystem, you defray risk and you leverage more capital than you would if you focused on a sole big business model that required support solely from the revenue from charging stations. These businesses and scenarios and site hosts, which is what we call our owners and operators, have to work in all the market segments that we're talking about. And the solutions that we have to look for have to not just work for families with 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. It has to work for folks who live in a high-rise, and I'm self-interested in that. I grew up on the 23rd floor of a high-rise in Manhattan. I didn't have a dedicated parking spot. Figuring out how we meet those variety of needs is going to require a complex array of interests, and we don't want to scare any of those away as we think about how to scale. As Senator Brandis said earlier, a key to the success in early AV efforts was maintaining private skin in the game, which is just as vital in the EV charging space. So I'm at least 10 minutes in, and I haven't really mentioned NEVI. And why is that? Because NEVI is a drop in the bucket. Meeting a 5x demand for EV charging by 2030 is going to involve investment at a scale that is beyond that and won't just take place along highway corridors. Now, that just doesn't mean that the drop in the bucket isn't important. The bipartisan infrastructure law tasked the NEVI program with accelerating equitable adoption of EVs, reducing transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, and positioning U.S. industries to lead global transportation electrification efforts and create good-paying jobs. No small task, but we have to acknowledge that if we are solely relying on that drop in the bucket, we're not going to meet those goals. So if we do want to achieve those goals, we have to think through how to turn that drop into something spicier, something with a few different elements that's going to cause a chain reaction, that's going to catalyze self-sustaining investment in infrastructure, not just add a little volume to what water is in the bucket. So, easy. Now what? I can share what ChargePoint's doing, and then I can share what we're seeing around the country. ChargePoint's committed to making this work, to achieving these goals and to leverage all of these different stakeholders that we work with every day. In terms of making sure we've got manufacturing in place, earlier this summer we partnered with the White House to announce a planned expansion to our manufacturing facilities in California. We are targeted and well on our way to meeting a goal of producing 10,000 direct current fast chargers and 10,000 level 2 chargers annually by 2026 to ensure that we're always able to have folks on hand who are trained and ready to install EV chargers. We partnered with the National Electrical Contractors Association to work with their 4,000 members to prepare them to install EV chargers from coast to coast. And we continue to work with all of our existing customers and expand into new customer bases, which is the same thing we've been doing for 15 years. Whether that be a rural co-op, whether that be a local Wawa, whether it be you in your home, in your garage, there's a way forward for all of us, but if we're targeting highway charging, having a broad, diverse array of interests is really important. What can states do? They've got a lot to accomplish. But the good news is that Florida's DOT has years of experience understanding and analyzing the EV charging regulatory and market barriers. If states want to catalyze that self-sustaining investment, but one way forward would be to focus on the outcomes rather than mandating specific solutions. So for example, while on-site generation of energy and on-site energy storage are a priority for many states, not every location is equally suited for those technologies. If you mandate that kind of a deployment or a business model or a specific technology, rather than encouraging the outcome you want to see, you're going to reduce participation in a program and inadvertently reduce the number of sites that could participate that are otherwise quite suitable. Flexibility ultimately is really key in ensuring innovation in partnerships, business models, and making sure that we have the full array of tools necessary to increase access to charging in rural, underserved, and disadvantaged communities. Partnering with local entities who know those areas best, like rural cooperatives and a whole host of other partners. By having a flexible approach, you can incentivize market participants to come up with a variety of solutions that then different departments of transportation can measure and give a fair shake. Lastly, it's important to not look at these issues in a vacuum. EV charging isn't just a transportation issue, it's a grid issue. It touches on many policy spaces. So the last example I'll leave you with is that traditional electricity rates were not designed with the unique characteristics of direct current fast charging. Demand-based electricity rates present a significant barrier to deploying and operating chargers. Owners of DC fast chargers often face significant economic burdens driven by demand charges, which come from a few peak sessions that occur each month, effectively penalizing hosts who turn on their chargers. So by looking at what a variety of states have done, over 30 states have targeted electricity tariffs that address that issue specifically while still providing clear market signals and avoiding burdens on ratepayers. So there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot I haven't touched on. I really appreciate your attention and look forward to the rest of the conference.
Well done. Kevin, appreciate that. We've got time for one question here. Sue, I'm going to keep it on time, don't worry. Well, ChargePoint's committed to making EV charging work. There's a trend brewing in society, charging anxiety. You read about it in newspapers, you go on PlugShare. What's ChargePoint going to do to help resolve charging anxiety?
Making it possible to have a charger wherever you need to park your car is key and critical. The other key piece is embracing the notion that we don't need to pattern match against traditional liquid fueling stations. One of the real challenges is that when whenever you have a disruptive technology like transportation electrification, you start to generate a lot of big ideas, capital B, capital I. And when you have a lot of big ideas, sometimes you can put yourself off track. And what I'm getting at here is the load from EV charging is incredibly flexible when it's flexible, but it's different in different places. At the end of the day, having more EV charging on the grid can and will put a downward pressure on electricity rates for all ratepayers with the proper incentives. But if we put command and control rules into the grid, if we prevent people from being able to get a charge when they need one, you can undermine the potential for transportation electrification by making the idea of plugging in unreliable, because you could all of a sudden have that power turn off. So trying to think about where we need to leverage flexible load, overnight load, longer term parking, and thinking about what are the more passive price signals we can set for highway charging where there isn't the ability to delay that charge. If you're stopping with like 3 kids in your electric minivan and 2 dogs, a cat, and everyone's nauseous, you can't wait an hour at the pit stop for a demand response event, right, to cease. So how do we target where the greatest benefit is? How do we create the appropriate circumstances to make it possible for a huge variety of site hosts, owners and operators to deploy chargers and to make those stations available to everybody?
The bottom line is you need good policy to do it.
Smart charging needs smart regulation.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, we're going on to my favorite topic now, autonomous trucking. Tom Jensen, Vice President of Government Affairs, TuSimple, because if you bought it, a truck brought it.
I screwed up the mic already.
Oh, shit. Oops.
All right, good afternoon. Inauspicious beginning. I've only done this 8,000 times.
You want to have a martini? We could have a martini on stage.
I didn't hear the overused joke, we're standing between you and happy hour. Did you use that already? Well, we are. So I'm Tom Jensen. It's the first time I've attended this conference, and I think it's been super insightful, frankly. Super insightful. And I appreciate everyone's time and attention this afternoon. So I work for TuSimple, a level 4 heavy-duty truck software developer and operator. We operate trucks today. I work in a space where I'm in charge of government relations, but in addition, safety. And we'll talk a little bit about safety. Grayson and I have been talking about that a little bit sidebarring. So we'll talk to you about what's going on kind of in the community, was the question, between TuSimple and our peer groups. And we've got Aurora and Waymo and Embark and Kodiak and good, innovative, I mean, really cool companies that are working on really neat stuff. And it's going to happen. I think it may happen a little slower than someone thought at one point, but it's going to happen. So I have a couple slides. There's a lot of things I hate, by the way. It's like airing of the grievances, right? I hate PowerPoint, but I put a couple up there. So let's go to the next one. I guess it's me, and we'll talk a little bit about the infomercial, and we'll move quickly through that. The reason I put a slide up to talk about kind of TuSimple and what happened in the fourth quarter of 2021, as we were at this conference, I wasn't here. I was working for a large motor carrier. It's got 120,000 trucks, and most of them are brown. And this time of year at that company, you know, you keep your head down, right, and your nose clean and your mouth shut, or they put you to work in a real job. So that being said, the kind of seminal event that TuSimple undertook and performed in the fourth quarter, December last year, when we had really an 80-mile run, fully autonomous run, was really, really cool. And all the crazy things that can happen on the way. And there's a lot of work that went into that, and a lot of testing and developments going on with our company and other competitors on the, again, the class 7 and 8 heavy-duty trucking side, right? Mapping and trying to short runs and figuring out what miles can be in AV mode, what are conventional. But this was the real deal and got a lot of publicity and was a real, you know, again, a watershed event, if you will. And since then, our company's been thinking about how we perfect that, not perfect, but perfect that technology and repeat that, right? Rinse and repeat and make it scalable. Obviously, that's the answer. Grayson, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have, but scalability as we move forward is the answer. And our peer group of companies, again, fine competitors and companies, are all at various stages on trying to kind of get there, but we're going to get there. Maybe a little slower than some thought, but we're going to. So enough of the infomercial, but let's talk, because I had talked to Senator Brandis, and I said, hey, Jeff, what does the group want to hear? What do you want to hear from this sector? And he said, well, kind of talk about 2022 and maybe next year. And some of this was covered this morning. Ariel Wolf's very good presentation, and the moderator did a great job this morning and talked about kind of what's going on. We are going to talk about the map a little bit, but effectively, this was a difficult year for many of these Class 7, 8, Level 4 developers. I mean, we are tech companies. Tech, big tech, small tech, you can fill in the blanks, has gotten absolutely punished in the equity markets. We all know that, the stories you hear, and that's, you know, we're in that group, and that's been difficult. It's been a very difficult operating environment from a financial perspective, but we forge ahead and we push and push, and there's been developments with companies, you know, one went out of business and changing models, if you will, but the key here, I think, that we've seen this year is that we've got some good momentum on some of the state legislative and regulation to make the environment more inviting. And there's this, you know, I don't know, mating dance going on, right, between OEMs and other key players in the industry and tech companies, who's aligned with whom. Some are aligned with multiple carriers, right, to try to figure out who we work with in the future. And I would, I'll state the obvious a lot, I suppose, but 5 years from now, this will look a lot different than it does today, the makeup in the industry. So I think that's key. And anything else that happened this year that's very clear, and I would debate this with anyone here in the room, we've really seen some critical mass in Texas and Arizona. It was referenced earlier, but that's a fact. And one of the reasons we've done that, and Grayson, you know this, is that we've got such a good operational environment with the state departments of transportation in those states. They are inviting. They are very open about it. They have conceded there could be a hiccup or two along the way, but we're here with you to make this successful. That's a pretty big deal, right? State government saying there could be a hiccup or two. And when I mean a hiccup, you know, it could be safety related, and that's a big step and a big, you know, concession, if you will, from the folks who regulate us. I don't want to belittle the map, but there's a reason I put it in there on purpose. And Grayson and I talked a little bit about this offline. And I think it was referenced earlier by Ariel, or one of the other speakers. Look at kind of the freight lanes that I show there in the highways. That's not all the interstates that are overlaid, of course, but as TuSimple and our competitor peer group looks at where this makes sense, it's got to be aligned with freight lanes, right? It has to be. Think about that. Every major trucking company and every major shipper knows their freight lanes, knows their pinch points, knows their bottlenecks, and is trying to figure out how to lessen those. And remember how freight moves. And by the way, I did make this up, I think, or no one's told me otherwise. Freight moves like water, as frictionless as possible. And increasingly today, freight's going to move as green as possible. Green, that's a good thing, right? As sustainable, as green as possible, as cheap as possible, as quickly as possible. And all those factors, you know, make it flows like water. And the whole notion of this, and I hate this term, another thing I hate, by the way, is this e-commerce thing. It's not e-commerce. What is it? Commerce. Your kids do things a hell of a lot different than we did, and their kids will do it differently. It's commerce, and it's all now digital. So forget about e-commerce, but the point is, much of what happened in the pandemic, and we know this, far from a marketing guru, but that's sticky, so to speak, right? And those patterns have stayed in many regards. Some have regressed, I suppose, but the point is, that's the mode now, and we're going to need, there's a lot of freight to go around, a lot of stuff that needs to be moved, and the autonomous piece on the commercial vehicle side is going to be critical. And there are players who are doing different things. Some are starting to do the last mile piece or a distribution center to a retailer. But this kind of ramp to ramp, or more than ramp to ramp, think launching pad, interstate highway launching pad, it's going to happen, and it's going to be aligned with freight lanes. So you look at the Texas Triangle there, with Dallas, San Antonio, Houston. I mean, you look at the border, and more trucks enter the United States from Laredo, Texas, than any point in the country, right? More trucks enter our country. We're going to align, and there will be winners and losers, with large fleets and large shippers. There's not a large fleet in this country that doesn't speak about efficiency every day, okay? Not just efficiency every day. People spend their careers in big trucking companies. Efficiency, network planning. How do we get bigger? How do we shave a tenth of a mile here? How do we shave this and that? You know, so let me say it again. There's not a large fleet in the company that doesn't speak about efficiency every day. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where we're going to get more efficient. So some of our competitors have talked about how we're going to building out a network and building out, look at that I-10 kind of corridor on the bottom part of the United States there. We spoke about Mississippi earlier. I personally do like the concept of using the term patchwork. That's not a four-letter word to me, patchwork. But I'll put a caveat on that, and I said this years ago to the CEO of the company I worked for at the time. I think it's the only thing the guy liked that I ever said. I said, we need a network, not a patchwork. And he was like, that was brilliant. I don't know if it was brilliant, I just kind of made it up. We need a network, not a patchwork. But if you operate planes, trains, automobiles, pipelines, you need what? You need a network, not a patchwork. So I think there's some legitimacy to that. So that's why I share the map. And we're going to work on Mississippi in 2023, and we're going to be successful, and it's going to help us build out that corridor where we can take city pairs and say to major shippers and to fleets, okay, we're going to work with you on this lane. Lanes are key to them. So where are we in 2023? And then we'll just have a little back and forth if we can. Much of this I already hit. Another thing I hate is the word collaboration. Overused. As much as I hate PowerPoint, collaboration's got to be up there too, because that's what everybody says. But the point is, DOTs that are more progressive, small p, I think are really user-friendly. User-friendliness matters. And the partnerships that companies like TuSimple and tech providers and trucking companies can have with DOTs makes a difference, number one. Number two, with the question mark, will there be an improved economic environment for tech? I don't know. I think it seems to me, not being a tech expert or being in this space that long, that many investors and folks were pretty bullish, and I'd ask Grayson for his opinion on this, may have gotten out over their skis a little bit on when this is going to happen. We definitely see it at TuSimple, and I see it personally. Another used cliche is evolution, not revolution. It came up in more words earlier today. That seems to make a heck of a lot more sense, frankly. So does that change expectations? I would suggest it does. How do we get there? How does the Waymos and Kodiaks and Auroras and TuSimples and everybody else kind of move forward? I think the expectations have been, a little bit of pump the brakes, if you will, on when we get there. And we will continue to see emerging alliances and partnerships throughout the industry as folks try to kind of figure it out. So will Mississippi stitch the South for us, so to speak, stitch the South? On I-10, I would suggest that's going to happen. And will we finally move in the direction, which is really a joke, by the way. California is a joke. So think about it. They passed a law 10 years ago to allow for autonomy to an extent, but capped it at 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating. 10,000 pounds. Guess what weighs more than 10,000 pounds? Oh, medium and heavy-duty trucks, needless to say. So 10 years later, they're starting to think about regulations. Now, we're a California company, so I suppose we've got to be careful in what form we say California's a joke. But that being said, a lot of the innovators are California companies, and states don't want to fall behind each other. That's fact, right? And regardless of the context, they don't want to fall behind each other, and they're starting to sense that. Geez, instead of you're a San Diego-based company, TuSimple, but you now have more employees in Arizona and Texas than you do in California. And we're a small company, but that's a fact. We're going to make those decisions, and I think our competitors are as well, because we need to go where the operating environment is ripe and where we can innovate. So that being said, I think they're starting to make, and they're inching, but it's a slow road to hoe in California. And those folks in the industry, we're very aligned on this. Can we be constructive, and can we push, and can we see if we can get there in a sensible fashion? So that's another 2023 development issue project, but that's why I have an exclamation point on it, because we might be dreaming after all how that gets resolved, and it will take a while. So that's the end of what I have to say. As you can see, Grayson, I did kind of phrase this challenges and opportunities, because I do think that's kind of where we are from a macro perspective, and it's an exciting space to be in. We in the trucking side, we don't see it as trucks versus passenger cars, not at all. And we don't wish ill on any other components of the whole ecosystem, right? We're all in it together in one regard, and we're going to get there. It may be a little longer than we thought, but these are good forums to exchange these ideas and to build relationships and to talk about how we get there to the extent we can collectively.
Tom, that was a really great overview. There's a lot of stuff happening in autonomy. More importantly, there's a lot of stuff happening in the economy. We have a rising rate interest environment. We're on the verge of a recession. We have out of control inflation. All prices seem to do is go up, and up. And then we have a lot of overpromises made by some of the competitors in autonomous trucking. They're running out of capital. Lucky for you, you have $1.1 billion in the bank. You're getting more money in on your interest. You've got runway. You came from UPS. Santa Claus is helping you guys deliver all the gifts in time for Christmas. You have a really great insight into all this. In your opinion, what is the current state of the autonomous trucking industry?
Well, I'd ask you if you have any good news, by the way, Grayson, the way you phrased that up. It is challenging.
Don't turn on the news and you'll find lots of good news.
I think it is challenging, and I think there's also cautious optimism that we're in a rough patch, rough period, and we got to get through it. I do think so. I mean, there's lots of competition for talent, you know, as some companies struggle and parts of the tech sector struggle. I mean, real talent, engineering talent. And I think we've seen that, but I think there is a cautious optimism that folks realize that this is going to happen. And again, once again, you've heard this. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
It's definitely a question of when. If we look at history, hopefully we don't have a Volcker moment. Inflation's going to go down at some point. Autonomous trucks offer a solution to help lower inflation. They can help unclog the ports. Everybody saw the videos of the drones at the port of LA. Why is there not a conversation being made that autonomous trucks can help to lower inflation? So if you go to a mom or you go to a family and say, autonomous truck can lower the price of the gallon of milk by $1 by 50 cents. That's going to have a very positive economic impact on their household budget.
Yeah, this is interesting dichotomy because we lead, and you know this, we lead with safety every time we have a conversation. For the obvious reasons, for the things I won't repeat because we've been through it. And I've heard it a lot today, by the way. I've been listening all day. Just hear what people said about, key topics of the day, and we talk safety, 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 and we do. Safety, of course, is not a priority. It's a value. It has to be a value. It doesn't matter what kind of company you work in. I've been in the trucking industry for 34 years. So that being said, shifting to the economic argument, we haven't done that yet. And Grayson asks a good question. Why haven't we? And I think, frankly, the safety piece helps us with the optics of the issue more than the economic inflation piece. I think, Grayson, you disagree, which is fine. And we brought it up, we've talked a little bit sidebar about this, in a thoughtful fashion, that we haven't done a good job getting there. We're hung up on safety. Now, is that a hang up? Absolutely not. But that's where we are.
I'm going to tell you this, safety is a buzzword.
Yep.
It's an irrelevant buzzword. Because if you run a business, you look at the economics, if you get into a crash or into an incident, you're out of business. You're going to already prioritize safety. Why is it being used as a marketing term?
So that's a great point. And I knew, by the way, he was going to say this because we talked about
thank you.
it. But the point is, we haven't looked at it that way. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong. I think this, though, Grayson, frankly, I think, folks, I think the origin of it was, well, let's lead with safety. And the next guy, let's lead with safety. And, we're trying to one-up each other, as opposed to looking at the broader implications. And the economic implications are significant. And the benefits, I won't go through it, are significant. But I go back to what I said before about efficiency. That's why the big fleets and the big shippers, they want to get more efficient. They want to get more efficient. I was talking to an old colleague just a couple weeks back at UPS. UPS's number one expense is what? Take a guess. Anybody? Employees, labor. Somebody said it, I think. I'll give it right. The number two expense is what? Transportation. That is how they move the bundles between their own network. That's their second biggest cost. How about Amazon? What does Amazon operate a lot of now that they didn't 10 years ago, 8 years ago? Trucks, right? Certain lanes, I'm on the interstate now, and certain lanes I see tons of Amazon trailers and trucks. Others I don't see as many. So so they figured out, how much it's costing us with UPS, with FedEx, with the Postal Service? Let's run our own our own trucks in the key lanes, the densest lanes. So they kind of cherry pick a little bit on that. So what's my point on this? Efficiency is where it's at. So maybe we need to kind of, and I hate the pivot word as well, but pivot more towards that on your point about inflation. I think we will get there.
Look at lanes. The most commonly trafficked freight route for autonomous is the Dallas to Houston route. Is there enough freight on that route as more and more trucks come online, or does that route become so oversaturated with autonomous trucks, it's time to look somewhere else?
Well, I think the idea here is to build some density and some scale, and then to look at other lanes, frankly. So I think that's the way most of us see it. Grayson, we want to, again, it's rinse and repeat, right? No. Rinse and repeat, and get really good at that, and say, okay, we're good, we're competent, we're confident, now where do we push next? But again, I'll go back to my point earlier. Major shippers and major fleets, they know their key lanes, and they know where they think they can get more efficient. So I think that'll drive the next lanes, if you will.
The big bugaboo in the room, Amazon. Andy Jassy's in there. He's focusing on cost cutting. You mentioned labor is a big cost. When does Amazon make a move on certain routes go into autonomous trucking? They have Zoox, but Zoox says they're not working on autonomous trucking. But if you just look at the pure economics of it, and I'll put this in perspective, they're cost cutting in the Alexa division. Yeah. That just tells you how broad and wide that cost cutting is going.
Yeah, I read that just recently, and I was kind of surprised because that's got to, in the big scheme of things, there's bigger fish to fry, right? So I think that's a question of, again, not if but when, but how quickly. So I mean, I think that trust me, slicing and dicing and analyzing this thing 6 ways to Sunday to figure out where can we run in AV mode and really to assist, our internal goods movement, because man, that's what transportation is. And I haven't heard this all day long, and this is another thing I made up, which I think is true. It's probably not. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong. But transportation, because I worked in the space for many, many years, and people say, what do you do? I work in transportation, like most of you in the room, or many of you in the room. What is transportation? Well, I see it as 2 things. I see it as personal mobility. We talked a lot about that today. And goods movement. I don't think I've heard the term goods movement today necessarily in that term. But that's what we're talking about. So I think Amazon backed it, personal mobility and goods movement. And I think Amazon is thinking, what is the most appropriate location to do that very thing, frankly.
Okay, so we're going to go down in the freight transportation rabbit hole for a minute. Intermodal. TuSimple has a partnership with Union Pacific. What's going to happen when a Class 1 railroad buys an autonomous trucking company to expand the tracks to a virtual railroad?
Well, it's going to be kind of cool, I would think. I mean, think about it. Class 1s have owned less than truckload companies before, right? Yeah. Union Pacific owned Overnight Express, which became UPS Freight, and then spun it off. And I think there will be a merge of those kind of technologies and modes. And I go back to my point earlier, which I don't hear a lot of people saying, but I know this from the policy arguments in Washington, D.C. This one is true. Most of what I said, of course, is what? Not true. But this is true. Trucks versus trains fight is silly. There's enough freight to go around. Now, the institutional actors and the instilled kind of, fighting that goes on and that friction that goes on, we should get over that. There's enough freight to go around. And I think that's inevitable, what you're suggesting, or at least they'll experiment there. Can a Class 1 own an AV company, and how does it interact, or how does it feed into the railroad? I asked this question earlier at a session we had down the hallway about on-property autonomy. And kind of interesting answer from the 2 ports in the railroad. They're necessarily working on property because there's some union concerns, and that's fair if that's the answer. But geez, on property, inside the 4 walls, the fences, that's where you can really make some initial gains on this. And I'm surprised more people aren't pounding their chest and talking about that. But I do think those modes blur a little bit as we talk about goods movement and freight mobility, as opposed to just trucking, railroad, airline.
You're in D.C., going back to the inflation issue again. We have a Republican Congress coming in. There's rumors swirling around that there potentially is an autonomous trucking bill coming in the House. If that happens and that comes there and they make the argument that autonomous trucking will reduce inflation, does that just die in the Senate because of the political nature of D.C. and that argument can't succeed?
Yeah, I'm afraid it does. The Senate's a different animal. The rules, that's the main thing, is the rules are different, as we all know. Very close margins in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. In the Senate, controlled by Democrats. Most of the substantive votes are not 50%, but they're 60 vote threshold. This kind of legislation inevitably is going to be a 60 vote threshold. There are instilled impediments to AV legislation, whatever it might be, including trial attorneys and the liability scheme, folks that are interested in that piece, workforce issues and unions. And I think the workforce piece has been a really big, Grayson and folks, a really big impediment and legitimate one. I've had conversations with U.S. senators, Democrats and Republicans. They said, we're okay with this, but how are we going to retrain? And I don't even know if that's the right question, excuse me. I don't know if that's the right question. Because there's going to be jobs. The jobs are going to be different. That's kind of our stock answer. But we need to think about that. That's been a very large impediment. So to answer your question, I'm afraid that doesn't, make it through the sausage grinder in the U.S. Senate.
You said it, and I'll just say it more bluntly, autonomous trucking will create jobs. You have lots of sensors on your trucks. They have to be calibrated. They have to be maintained. It's a new job skill set. They're higher paying jobs. And then today, your safety drivers, they can go home to their families at night. They're not going over the road. There's a lot of positive benefits. What Tara's doing at PAVE is a phenomenal job to educate the public about the positivities of autonomous trucking, but we have this drive-by media on an agenda that just says, oh, there's a Tesla, it's a self-driving car. Now we're going to see the incident if a Tesla semi gets into it. self-driving Tesla truck gets into a crash.
Right.
How do we stop all the shenanigans?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm afraid that for each one of those, and by the way, Tara and Pave, they do a great job, by the way. We think they do fantastic work. So each one of those incidents, and we have no joy if it's a competitor, if it's on the passenger side, that optic is a problem, and we got to get through that. One thing we're doing, to your point about jobs and new jobs, is working with a community college in Arizona that takes someone who was going to get a traditional commercial driver's license in the past and kind of give them a commercial driver's license / test engineer certificate. So we basically made it up. Here's what you got to do to be a test engineer as opposed to just being a commercial vehicle operator. And that's pretty cool because that person now thinks I'm part of the future and I'm kind of part of the solution, and I'm not getting a technical degree or certification that's going to put me out of work. So I don't have a good answer. I think we need more, I've used this term before, it's a PR comms term. We need more validation. We need more validators, people in this room, academics, folks talking about societal benefits of automation and how a hiccup or two in the road should not derail the progress. And as I indicated earlier, I was actually shocked when someone from the Texas Department of Transportation kind of used that in more words to me sitting this close. So we know that's going to happen, but we got to get there, and if it happens, and what they're really talking about is, unfortunately, some sort of an accident, and and a bad, big public dust-up related to safety. But we know that the end of the day, the destination, we're going to be better off. And I was like, that's awesome. Can you tell some other people that?
Does the future of autonomous trucking come down to partnerships?
I think so. So I think the landscape is interesting, Grayson. I, as indicated, worked 32 years for a company that's 115 years old. My hunch is my company today is not going to make it to 115 years old. It's just there's going to be melding, and I think the original equipment manufacturers are trying to figure out the best player to not necessarily license, but to embed the technology, right, and figure out the truck of tomorrow, the Class 8 power unit. And again, we're talking autonomy now, not necessarily electric, but what does that look like in the future? Does it have this suite where you can go into AV mode, where you can extend a commercial vehicle operator, that's a truck driver, right, his or her hours of service? Can we work on the regulatory scheme there to extend their hours of service because they were in AV mode for this amount of time, this amount of miles, that kind of thing? So I think that's the truth. I really do. I tell you, I digress, but it's interesting and a sad story, kind of. For many years, and you know a little bit about this, I know, my job in Washington was to go to these truck hearings, congressional hearings, House and Senate. And for many years, I was working on bigger trucks, bigger, heavier trucks. And it was pretty rough because I was the trucking guy, and I had nice folks that I hung with, the trucking crowd. They were all professional and experts in this area. And in the back of the room, and on the way into the hearing, we would see victims groups. And victims groups don't say, I'm a victims group. They hold up a picture of a loved one who died in a car-truck accident. And it was freaking rough because, it's rough. And that was rough. And sometimes they call me and say, you work for a huge fleet and you're their DC guy. How come you don't support this? How come you support that? And why are you looking for bigger and heavier trucks? Let me tell you the story about my wife, husband, son, daughter, niece, nephew. You fill in the blanks. I mean, horrific. And that, over many years, made me think. And that's why I can't get off the safety thing, as much as I love the economics argument. And we are going to get there. But that's a true story. And that is a difficult thing. And the members of Congress, they do it on purpose, of course. And they got a heart, too, believe it or not. They have a heart, too, So, again, I digress. I'm not really sure what that adds. But I think that's really, collectively, a challenge. But yet the folks in this room are open-minded enough and smart enough to know that we're going to be better off. So what was the question?
There's a deep story. Let's wrap with this. How do you see the industry evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Do we see OEMs gobble up the AV companies, embed them fully, and then run the services themselves, very similar to what we saw with Volvo and the autonomous transport solution announcement the other day?
I think so, but I think there's steps along the way that we got to get there first. For example, TuSimple and our peer group, has done a really good job on the law enforcement side and talking to law enforcement about what this is and what this isn't, right? And that's I think, so important for us to do moving forward for the acceptability. And we got to get over all the various things that can happen, the unexpected kind of scenarios as we perfect the technology to gain that credibility and wider acceptance, if you will. And then I think it's inevitable that, again, a carrier, that is a manufacturer, excuse me, is, it marries up with one of these tech companies, and the tech company becomes a subsidiary, they don't exist, or maybe they license the technology. I don't know exactly how that looks, but I think that's exactly what it looks like, and it's just a question of how quickly does that union, happen, frankly.
Yeah. Interacting with law enforcement for autonomous trucks is critical. Brett is in the audience from Kodiak. He's an all-star at this. If you want to learn about autonomous trucks and law enforcement interaction, and really great police stories, Brett's over there. He can answer all those questions because it's really important. Tom, thanks for the time as always, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for hanging in there, guys. Great seeing everybody. Oh, yeah. A picture.
Oh, Jesus Christ. We're going to have Chris Tomlinson, Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting, is going to share the trends in transportation. Chris, welcome to the stage, please.
How you doing?
I'm looking forward to this.
Hey, ought to be good. It's interesting to come up here and talk about trends, emerging trends, and doing it in the afternoon when you've been talking about the trends really all day. So we'll see if we can make the two match up together. So a lot of what we've been talking about today, these emerging trends and what we're seeing happen in transportation, whether we're talking about autonomous vehicles, electrification. A lot of this is happening in the context of unprecedented changes that we're seeing in the US and specifically out of the federal government as we look at the amount of funding that's coming down in IJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're seeing levels of funding that we have not seen since the New Deal. Levels of funding that we have not seen since Eisenhower decided to create and fund the interstate system. And the question really is going to become, how do we best use these funds to play some catch up and hopefully accelerate in some areas? Because even at these unprecedented levels, it still doesn't fully address all of our challenges. At Deloitte, we put out this Transportation Trends Report. And this year, we've taken note of 5 different trends that we're seeing happening. One, we've been talking about it all day, but there's a need to create a sustainable, ongoing funding source. Because even, as I just said, these incredible levels of funding, it's a shot in the arm. It doesn't solve the problems that we face long term. 2, electrification and EVs are fundamentally changing the issues that we have to tackle for where we as a country, where we as an industry expect to go. And a lot of that is a generational shift that we'll be talking about. Pull it back. 3, modernizing the infrastructure. There's been so much talk about the issues that have been created by the pandemic and how this has brought to light new problems and accelerated and created problems. But some of them is just that, an acceleration of problems. Our infrastructure has been aging for a long time. We have a history of deferred maintenance, and we're starting to see the impacts of that. And that's on top of our already existing needs. So how we address that moving forward is going to be key. Next, how do we make the network, both what exists and what we plan to build, more resilient to both attacks that are coming because of the cyber security threats that are posed by the very advances that we want, this whole notion of connected vehicle infrastructure. We are going to be trading unprecedented amounts of data and information, some of it including personally identifiable information. And for this to work in its most efficient format, we want as many vehicles to be able to send and receive data. And each one of those could be a potential target or it could be a potential threat. And last, as we continue to figure out how we're going to modernize our infrastructure, exactly how are we going to do this? How are we going to pilot and then, more importantly, move from pilots, because we have a lot of those efforts, but actually scaling up these efforts. So these are things that we have to tackle, and these are the trends that we see. So first, talking about how are we going to fund our transportation needs going forward. We know we need a more sustainable funding mechanism than the gas tax. Every day, and we're sitting here talking about electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, but we primarily fund this on the gas tax. So as fuel efficiency goes up or we switch the propulsion system away from a gas-powered vehicle, we're literally accelerating the problem. The issue is we know that this problem exists, but there isn't necessarily the political will to go ahead and make the change that we need. What you see on the screen there is a map of all the different states that are thinking about or taking steps dealing with road user charging, sometimes called VMT, or mileage-based user fees. There's now funding in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $75 million for states to continue to do more pilots. But there's also money to do $50 million to do a nationwide ruck pilot. And everyone is waiting to see the federal government and what the regulations is and how we're going to do that. But we've been doing pilots for a while. So one trend that we're hoping to see is that for this next slew of pilots that will come up, are we going to ask some different questions? Because there's lessons learned from the existing pilots, but there's a reason to do more. A lot of the pilots have been revenue neutral so far. We've looked at how do we just do a one-for-one replacement, trying to figure out your average amount of gas tax, when in actuality, we already have a gap. So how are we going to determine what is the right amount to charge? That has not been really the focus of the pilots, but hopefully in this next set of pilots it will be. Number two, how do we get widespread acceptance of what would be a fundamentally different way of charging? In looking at road user charging, how do we essentially convince the people that this is good? How do we find out if it's good? The reality is today, people are looking at this as another form of taxation. And the reason for that is they really don't have a fundamental understanding of how the gas tax works today. It is obscured from them. The fact that something that's road user charging based could give them the ability to see exactly how their usage translates into what they pay. And hopefully we can also add additional transparency into how those monies are used, would bring it into the same realm of utilities, where you can look on your bill and see how much electricity you're using or water, and you can understand that correlation. If we are able to do that, that may be different. The other thing we need to seriously consider in this next set of pilots is probably one of the most difficult of all. But most of the pilots, if you look around the country, have been small numbers of people in the low hundreds. A lot of them are on a voluntary basis. It's not a reflection of the way everyone pays today. And it runs the risk that you have willing participants who may give a false sense of acceptance of the approach. So the very difficult task of how do we evolve into something that's different, that has a true spectrum of the affected people, is something that needs to be tackled in this next series of pilots. Electric vehicles. Hard to say something that hasn't been said about this all day, but even in the most recent two speakers. But take a look at this map. It underscores what you've heard all day. The problem is one of infrastructure. Even the most, California has the most stations. It's still inadequate to meet the needs. And what's happening with the NEVI plans will help, but it won't quite get us there. So we're going to have to come up with new ways to approach and hopefully tackle this issue. Scaling is the problem. And then also equity is a problem. The Biden administration has made it crystal clear of their focus on equity, especially in the area of transportation with their Justice 40 initiative. Right now, as we see more and more adoption of EVs, it's still at the higher end. Those people who are spending greater than 30% of their income on transportation don't have access to the EV technology from an affordability standpoint. And so right now, we're not on a path to deal with it from a sort of equitable distribution. You do have some states, such as California, who are trying to address this. You have other entities, such as New York, who's dedicating money, working with their utilities, again, to try to expand the EV charging infrastructure all over, even where it may not make initial business or economic sense. And then lastly, the Biden administration and the White House specifically has been focused on this talent pipeline challenge, where they're not only trying to look and address this issue, but use it for workforce development to identify ways to train up a new workforce, especially in underserved communities, that can help either build out this infrastructure or help maintain it, whether it's in the battery space or the infrastructure space. But the equity is another trend, and it doesn't end just with the EV space. This picture is just showing you a curb cut. This is not something that was something you would have seen back in the 50s and 60s. And it really came from wheelchair advocates really pushing for this. But it also, I use as a very simple and straightforward example of a change that was coming from a group who was demanding equity, but it's made a difference to everybody. It's not just wheelchairs that use these. Anyone who's moving things up and down, anyone with mobility challenges, et cetera. So the challenge from the Biden administration is to fundamentally rethink how we're designing our transportation systems with equity in mind and seeing what other types of outcomes come forward from that. And you will see this, especially in, we believe you will see this, especially in their discretionary grant programs. As agencies go for money, they have to be able to address the equity question if they're going to remain competitive for these discretionary funds. And so you see agencies such as Caltrans, or here in Florida, the Broward MPO, starting to index their projects to understand their equity impact, to understand how not only are they going to meet the needs of their citizens, but are they going to remain competitive for these dollars? Because again, although there's a lot of dollars, it's still going to be awarded on a competitive basis. And those that are addressing the points that the administration and the law are focused on tend to fare, or going to fare better. That brings me back to the resiliency issue. It's cybersecurity threats, but it's also climate threats. Again, we don't have to look far from the state we're in, the devastating effects of hurricanes and washing out the only connectivity to an island-based community. More and more, it's not a question of all the political debates around the climate change. It's a question of the aging infrastructure and building for whatever the ongoing climate conditions are, so that it is a physically resilient infrastructure. And that's going to cost money, a lot of money. And so it's something that people need to factor in. And then you add on top of that inflation, and you add the cybersecurity. It's going to take some smart planning, and again, the dollars may not go as far when you truly start factoring and prioritizing based on these needs. And last but not least, this entire conference is talking about these unprecedented innovations in technology. But we need to get better, and we need to focus on how do we scale up. We're doing some incredible pilots. We have a history, especially on the government side, and for those that don't know my background, with Deloitte today, but 6 months ago, and for the 24 years before that, I was in the public sector. We love our pilots. We adore our pilots. I have a long list of very innovative pilots, but run into problems previously into scaling them up. We're now starting to find our way through that. Again, JTA and their methodology that they're using to test, prove, expand, test, prove, expand, identifying useful and meaningful phases so the pilot is not only getting information, but giving them a useful component. And it builds as a stage before they take, for example, their circulator from a fixed guideway into the ultimate later phase where it's also operating in mixed traffic. But if we don't actually address the ways to scale these things, we will end up with a series of innovative ideas and lots of white papers instead of final solutions that can be patterned and repeated in different states and different jurisdictions. This, I actually believe, is one of the greatest challenges to all of our discussions of innovation. Are we stopping and asking, yes, but do we see a pathway to fully scale this up to make a meaningful impact? Without it, we're missing a very key component into actualizing the changes that we're hoping to have. So you can find more about all of these trends and that information in these reports that are available on our website. We also have a global version which talks about some of these trends and a few others that obviously isn't focused on the IJA bill or the IRA bill since they don't apply outside the US. But with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Chris, well done, sir. Well done. A lot to unpack. There's a lot to unpack there. You have the background in the public sector, so you understand how the government works, city councils work, all the regulatory bodies that go in there, and there's challenges because certain council member might have an agenda for this project versus that project. How are we gonna modernize the infrastructure, as you said that we need to do?
I think we have to do two things. One, you still need your sponsors, like Senator Brandis here in Florida. So you need to find out what are the issues that they want to address. And what I actually like about politicians is they have a bad rap, but they're actually the best listeners. They are hyper-tuned to how their constituent may or may not react. And that's really what we have to do. Understand who is the end beneficiary, talk to them more, and keep that as the focus. I love the technology, I geek out on the technology, but it's the other part that goes along with the scaling. It's, have we figured out the communication message to get the benefit across? Because for example, in road user charging, I don't think that we have at all. And so the public doesn't want to hear it because they don't understand it. And we've spent so much time on the technology piece instead of explaining the pending crisis that's coming and why it should matter to them.
Messaging matters, messaging which gets the elected officials elected. I want to go down to the local level with you. You're based in Atlanta. I've spent some time in Atlanta, and every time I go to Atlanta, unfortunately, there's more and more traffic, and it seems to get worse by the day. As you look to deploy new technologies, look to modernize the infrastructure, What sort of transportation solutions could be put in there so when you go to Atlanta, it's not like, oh no, it's going to take me 2 hours to go from this part of town to that part of town?
Well, a couple of things. One, about the traffic in Atlanta, you're right, but in the jobs I had in the public sector, you saw traffic, I saw job security. So, and there's, I mean, it's a joke, but it's also an indication of a thriving economy. I mean, would you rather deal with a situation with a lot of traffic, which is a real problem, we need to address the congestion, or no traffic, because that means your economy's dead. So there is this balancing act. But one of the things that we need to do a better job on with these issues is finding that balancing act, working with the communities to figure out what's going to work, and being a lot more honest with them about both the time frame and the pain. You know, we used to joke, maybe it wasn't a joke, but we would talk internally, like everyone loves seeing the renderings of the final project. You know, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die first. We know the orange barrels have to be out there, but we have to do a better job of being transparent with the time frame. We've gotten pretty good with the costs, and really trying to help people have the patience to see to the future. And we're just still not that good at it, in my opinion.
When you look to the future, transportation agencies across the United States have done pilots, but they're one-offs and they don't scale. How do we erase that? Where when you do the pilot, it turns into a real project as a meaningful benefit on that local community?
I think we have to get out of the competition aspect with the pilots and get more into the copycat business where it makes sense. If there's been success, build upon that success. So you notice there have been several RUC pilots, and I mentioned there's funding. The next round of pilots, in my opinion, needs to answer and tackle some different questions. And so it needs to be a collective process of building one upon the other. But when someone does find a way to meaningfully scale, we need to copy that. And that's the beauty, especially if this is happening in government. You're not going to run into copyright problems, et cetera. But too often, multiple agencies are, I believe, competing for the spotlight instead of just saying, hey, I started on the shoulders of Nat and JTA, and I decided to go and tackle this additional problem. And hopefully, collectively, we'll get a solution.
Well said. As we look to wrap up, there's a lot of change happening in transportation, as you know. You went from the public sector to the private sector, Deloitte. What are you most excited about when it relates to the future of transportation?
That's a good question. The convergence of lessons learned across multiple industries. I think too often we looked at certain problems as a public sector problem or a private sector. And I'm very excited that we're starting to see more of a partnership, be it California, and Georgia has one as well. It's a Make Ready program where the utilities are partnering. They're sharing intellectual know-how and helping these governments who don't have this type of subject matter experts on board to help advance what they need to do with the infrastructure. And they're doing it for two reasons, right? I mean, in the case of anything electric, the utilities, well, they're going to get the bill more. But they're also very concerned that somebody may have a champion, and it could be a politician, and there are mandates that come out that trigger the need for a new substation that they're not going to receive the direct funding for. So they want to see smart growth. So if you take their private sector needs, coupled with our desire in the public sector to be able to scale, and they certainly have examples in the private sector of successful figuring out how to scale, it can actually be a happy marriage to move things forward collectively. So we have to have more and more of these public-private partnerships, not just in the funding and financing, but truly in the collaboration space. And that also means, I think, on the public sector side, we have to be open to trying to reduce some of the regulatory barriers and paperwork to not stifle that innovation before it even gets started.
Lee from TuSimple said it. You said it, sir. Partnerships do matter. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well done. Well done. Well done. All right, this is a special one. Maynard Factor, Vice President of Business Development, Kratos Defense and Security Solutions, Unmanned Systems Division, is going to join us, and he's going to make a product announcement. Maynard, welcome to the stage, sir.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, Grayson. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I certainly appreciate you guys sticking around. And yeah, so what I want to do is I certainly don't want to eat up a bunch of time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the Kratos Defense Driverless Truck Deployment Program, some of the things that we have going on here in the state in Florida, as well as other locations. And I know most of you are probably thinking, oh boy, here's another driverless truck company. But we are actually doing something a little different from the normal TuSimple and Kodiak models. And I'll go into that a little bit here in a moment. I'll just do a quick intro. Let's see, green button. I'll just do a quick intro on Kratos Defense and who we are and how a company like a defense contractor ends up in the driverless trucking supply chain industry. So Kratos Defense, as the name implies, we are a defense contractor. We are a national security focused technology and product development company. We tend to focus on leading edge technologies as opposed to bleeding edge technologies where there's proven systems and technology available that we can now adapt into solving some real world problems, which I'll get into here in a little bit. And what this does is it helps facilitate quicker deployments and mitigates a lot of risk in some of the things that we do. I wanted to put this picture up because I figured by the end of the day, everybody's probably tired of looking at cars and trucks. So what this is, that airplane in the front is our airplane. It's called the Valkyrie. It's a uncrewed combat aerial system, and it was designed by Kratos. You see it here flying with in formation with the F-22 and the F-35. And in this particular application, it was acting as a translator between the two aircraft. Because what some people don't know is those two aircraft actually cannot communicate to each other. They're on different radio networks and different data formats. So our aircraft was flying with those two planes, and it's about 30 feet long and has a wingspan of about 27 feet. So it's a pretty big aircraft, and it's just kind of cool. It's an example of some of the cool technology that Kratos has developed. My company supports that aircraft, developing some of the autopilots and different subsystem electronics that are on board on the aircraft, and part of the reason for me showing that picture is that a lot of the technologies and capabilities that went into the design of that aircraft and a lot of other products that Kratos develops also play into what we're doing in the driverless vehicle industry. So Kratos has a number of different divisions. I won't go through all this, but essentially we have a missile defense division, satellite communications, C5ISR, a lot of very unique and capable systems that are fielded by the U.S. government as well as a lot of our allied partners. The partner word again. I operate in the Unmanned Systems Division of the organization. So in the Unmanned Systems Division, we essentially have two main sister divisions. So we have the Kratos Unmanned Aerial Systems, which is the group that makes the airplane. And then we have the division, the sister division that I come from, which is in Florida, headquartered in Florida. We do, like I said, the subsystem electronics for the aircraft, as well as the driverless vehicle systems that we originally developed for deployment with military defense applications. And I'll sort of walk you through some of this a little bit. Our initial driverless vehicle technology was developed for the military defense applications. We actually started with vehicles that the military was providing us that we would retrofit, and these vehicles were used as driverless targets. So these are target drones. So what they do is they drive these vehicles downrange, they're remotely controlled, and then the airplanes come in and they go blow them up. And they do air-to-ground defense training. So they're doing training systems, and they're also doing weapons evaluation programs. And it's really a cool business model. It's a cool business to be in. When you think about it, you know, they're constantly blowing up your product, so you're always having to replace it. It always reminds me of the Jay Leno commercial, the Doritos commercial. You know, crunch all you want, we'll make more. So that's the ground targets market, and we have automated a lot of really cool vehicles, cars, trucks, SUVs. We've done Humvees, as you see here in the picture. We've also done T-72 tanks. So we've had tanks at our facility, and automating those vehicles is quite a bit different than automating a vehicle with a steering wheel. But anyway, it's very cool stuff. But the challenge with that market is it's actually pretty small. You know, there's not a lot of folks out there needing to blow up vehicles, unfortunately, because it'd be a lot cooler if it was. But so we started looking at the tactical arena, and we started going after applications where we could leverage our technology to reduce warfighter exposure in dangerous missions like resupply and route clearance. So we're making some headway there, and how we ended up in the commercial space is we actually were here at the Florida Automated Vehicle Summit back in 2014, and I think that was one of the earlier events, and we were contacted by one of the people hosting the event. They said, hey, you know, we see you're in the defense driverless vehicle business. Can you come down and do a demonstration? So we brought one of our vehicles down here, and we got some good feedback on it, and somebody actually walked by and said, hey, you can actually retrofit this vehicle and with automation? We said, yeah. And they said, you know, sure would be cool as a crash attenuator vehicle. Really would solve a big safety issue in a mobile highway maintenance operation. So, you know, me being in the defense business for almost 30 years, I had no idea what a crash attenuator vehicle was. So I got on the Google, looked it up, and very obvious to tell. I don't know if folks are that familiar with these types of vehicles, but these vehicles are deployed in mobile highway work zones. So if you could imagine, when they're putting striping down on the road or they're doing a sweeping operation, they're slow-moving operations. They're basically closing down a lane to do the work, and they have a vehicle that follows behind the work vehicle, and it has a big attenuator on the back. And basically what that vehicle is there to do is provide a sort of a crash barrier for the workers and the equipment in the work zone. So it provides a layer of protection. However, these vehicles are quite often impacted by the traveling public, distracted drivers, texting, anything you can imagine. And the idea is when they veer into the work zone by accident, they don't crash into everybody. They crash into this attenuator, which you can kind of see in these pictures folded up on the back of the truck. That actually unfolds, and you can see in that bottom picture of the Indiana DOT one. So it works very well in a lot of applications in cushioning the driver, protecting the driver who entered the work zone, and also cushioning the person who drives the TMA truck. It's called a truck-mounted attenuator. The challenge is sometimes these vehicles are impacted by an 80,000-pound tanker truck at going 65 miles an hour, and it doesn't really end well in a lot of cases for the person who's designated to operate that vehicle at the time. So what we did is we saw it was an opportunity to increase safety in the work zone. It aligned very closely with what we're doing in the tactical arena. So we contacted a company that makes these types of vehicles, said, hey, what would you think about automating this thing? And they said, yeah, if you could do it, that'd be great. Take the driver out, move them to another location in the work zone, which is what we did. We developed a leader-follower platooning configuration for this, where we install equipment in the lead vehicle, the work vehicle, the striper or the sweeper, and we install kit in the TMA truck, making it autonomous or automated. And basically the way it works is as the lead vehicle is driven down the road, it's human-driven. Navigation data is collected and transmitted to the follower vehicle, right? So it's been working very well. We have 13 or so systems that have currently been deployed across the United States. We also have systems in England. And we have been working very closely with DOT and other industry partners who have been great in providing us input and how to really develop the system so that it closely aligns with how people use the truck. You know, us coming from the defense world, we're certainly not subject matter experts in the highway maintenance arena, so we've collaborated very closely with different DOTs. We had a deployment here in Florida as well, and we worked very well with Florida DOT and Florida Highway Patrol, and they provided some great feedback and some great input on these vehicles, and things are moving forward very nicely. And from here, we got into the driverless semi business, right? So we found a very niche area in the trucking industry where we're supporting the ag and renewable energy markets. We're doing short haul runs in areas where you have a ramp up of requirements for a significant amount of drivers. Like if you can imagine in the ag industry, they have harvesting requirements, so they require quite a few trucks on the road to support that. So as I mentioned, short haul, we're running 24/7. We're running these trucks, as you can see. Something that's a little unusual with most driverless trucking companies that you've seen is this particular picture shows the tanker trucks. These are currently deployed on I-10. We're doing deployment trials. This is not actually the area where we will ultimately deploy these vehicles. We're under contract with several different organizations who provide us their vehicles. We bring them down here to Florida, at least in this early stage of the game, in running these pilots. We install the automation systems, we test them, we do all kinds of different things here with them. And then the vehicles will go back to the areas where they're actually going to be deployed. Locations in the Northwest Passage are areas that are very popular and that we're working with very closely. There's also other areas in Florida and some locations in the South. If you can imagine areas where there's quite a bit of agricultural activity is where we're putting these trucks. They are operating in leader-follower mode. As I mentioned, the driverless vehicle is human-driven. As it moves on down the road, it transmits its navigation data to the follower. There's a lot of safety systems that have been built into this vehicle. We have a lot of experience now with deploying systems with DOTs across the United States, and a lot of lessons learned in how to harden the system and increase safety for the system, and leveraging in some of the stuff that we've developed for the military, with some of the artificial intelligence that's in the vehicles and hardening the communications link with encryption and frequency hopping and all kinds of fancy things that enable these vehicles to safely and reliably go down the road have all been implemented into the system. And we started deploying driverless vehicles back in about 2008, 2010 with the military, so there's a long history of that capability built into these vehicles, as well as capability from some of the other divisions of Kratos that have contributed to the development of the system to ensure everything is going to meet the needs of these customers. And so let's see what we got. Here, just a kind of a close-up of the vehicle. We're deploying these vehicles right now in trials in the Northwest Florida area. We have them running on I-10. We have them running on Highway 90. We have them running on Highway 85. So a lot of different arenas. We're putting hours on the system. We have some of the customers, as I mentioned, are from some of the Northwest states, and surprisingly, they want to do their training and their deployment trials down here in Florida. So we're hanging around here with their trucks, and we'll plan on sending them back up later this year, and they're going to actually integrate them into their operational scenarios and run the routes that are approved. We have received some formalized platooning approvals from some of the different states that we're operating in, which are states that in a lot of cases we were the first ones to come in with an approved platooning plan. So really cool, a lot of groundbreaking stuff. I'm very excited to be a part of this project. I didn't think that we would be operating in supply chain capacity, but in reality, when you really think about it, and you can even see where Department of Homeland Security has identified the supply chain as a critical national security concern. And what we're doing here is the reason that people want to deploy these trucks or need to deploy these trucks is they don't have enough people to drive them. And I know it sounds kind of funny, everybody talks about the driver deficit. Well, right now you got about an 80,000 person deficit in the community. Customers that I have open recs for drivers that are in the quantity of 600 or so. When you think about ag and running 24/7, it requires a lot of people. And there are even instances where driver requirements like CDLs are actually waived because it's so critical and they have to move these vehicles that they're willing to waive those requirements and to get the vehicles on the road. So what we're doing here in deploying this technology is we're really providing an augmented means to support the supply chain. When you don't have available drivers and you need to move the product, you have our automated system in your vehicles that you can deploy in the leader, follower, platooned configuration. You could also use it to enhance your productivity. You could maintain your hauling capacity with half as many drivers, right? If you had that scenario, or you can play around with the numbers and increase your haul capacity with greater than half amount of drivers, or they're going to play all kinds of games with how they want to deploy these. And I can't really go into a lot of details in the models. We're still in the pilot stages with a lot of these customers, and NDAs are in place, but. In any case, I wanted to show the vehicles. It's cool that we're able to deploy these in Florida, and really that the idea and the concept and the technology all evolved for this commercial application here from the FAV Summit. So it's just kind of a neat thing to be able to do. This last chart shows this is the route where we're currently running. What you see here is the I-10 route, the I-10 loop that we're doing, which is actually starting at Highway 85. We're going east on I-10. And then we're circling back on Highway 90 and just running the loop, putting miles on the system and training the drivers that are actually going to use the systems in the locations that they are ultimately going to deploy in their operational scenario. So with that, I have a video. It's a really cool video, so you guys that stuck around are in for a little bit of a treat, so you get to see the vehicles on the road. If we can go ahead and cue up the video, that'd be cool. Hopefully it works. Otherwise, there we go. Yeah, so there's a lot really in that video to kind of see it for the first time. There's a lot of key points. Like one of the things that they were showing was the obstacle detection, and it showed the guy who was just sort of standing there, and then he starts running. So what they were demonstrating is that the vehicle actually sees the person. As the person's moving forward, the vehicle will creep up, and it maintains a certain safe distance between that person and the vehicle. And as the person stops, the vehicle stops. So that was what we're demonstrating there. There's also demonstrations of operating in different lighting conditions, downtown scenarios, highway scenarios. So it's been an interesting ride, and we are excited to move this project forward and actually get into some of the operational scenarios, which should be on the road soon. So thank you guys. Good.
Maynard, thank you. We're glad to have you here in Florida. This wouldn't be possible without Jeff Brandis. So Jeff, thanks for your leadership over the years. Even though you're retired, we still love you, and we're going to keep moving your dream forward. So thank you.
Thank you. That's good. That's great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And it's 5:30. I like to drink. It's bar time. Oh, no?
Uh-oh.
Oh, I'm sorry. I still am going to have a drink. Up.
This is the winner. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Senator Brandis. We've been holding a raffle, and we encourage you all again. We're going to be having another one tomorrow. And so if you get an opportunity to drop off your business card over at the U2C JTA booth. But today we want to announce the raffle winner of a DJI Mini SE drone, and Senator Brandis has the winner.
This was a fair and just election. We've had the election security people from the state of Florida confirm this. The winner of this prize that they can now wrap up and send to their kids for Christmas, this wonderful drones, is James Fleury from Pasco County. So James, congratulations. Put your card in for tomorrow's drawing and we'll box one up for your kids too. Thank you all. Join us out for a reception and have a great evening. Hope you enjoyed the day.